Welcome to the Secure Start podcast, brought to you by the Secure Start Aura apps, supporting trauma-informed care and practice at home and in school.
The children's behaviour was a way of asking for something that they really needed. And I mean, one example of it was that there was one time a spate of stealing in the school community at Summerhill, and the children got together and decided that the best response to this was to give presents to the young person that was doing the stealing. One of the team is sitting with the young person now, and we are going to have a meeting all together as a team because it's clear to us we've been missing something in his communication. A very important Winnicottian and Drysdale idea was how the parents, function as mirrors to the child's experience. Winnicott's beautiful phrase, when I look, I'm seen, and so I exist. And the child gets to know himself through his mother's and his father's eyes and through their care. The essential task, really, when it comes down to it, is presence and being there for the children, because what they are doing is searching for missing relational experiences of being seen. So what they're after is a certain kind of compassionate witnessing that is the essence, I think, of working with traumatized people. Something about when I was in the grip of these very strong emotions, in my case fear and anxiety and feeling out of control, how impossible it was for me to think of their situation at all. But the legacy, I think, really, is about how do we support the adults best to do this really, really important work, meeting all the needs of the children that I said, but then meeting the adult needs as well.
Welcome to the Secure Start podcast. I'm Colby Pearce, and joining me for this episode is another inspirational guest with a connection to the Cotswold community. Before I introduce my guest, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I come to you from, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and acknowledge the continuing connection the living Kaurna people feel to land, waters, culture, and community. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My guest this episode is Paul van Heeswijk. Paul qualified as a child psychotherapist in 1981 and is a member of the Association of Child Psychotherapists. He was a member of the Bowlby Centre until he retired in 2024. Paul worked in child and adolescent mental health services and child psychiatry in London since 1981, including a Tier 4 eating disorders unit between 2009 and 2014. Between 1991 and 2000, Paul was consultant psychotherapist to the Cotswold Community. He has also consulted to several other social care organisations in Ireland and in the UK, and to foster care services in England. Welcome, Paul, to the Secure Start podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Colby. I'm very pleased to be here.
And I did chase you up probably nearly 12 months ago. I approached you to come onto the podcast, and it wasn't a good time for you, but you gave me an absolute gem of a name and representation to that person on my behalf to come on, and that was Peter Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of my favourite podcast, the one I did with
Mhm.
Peter. Yeah,
Mhm.
and he is still the only guest that I have forgotten to give the questions to beforehand, which I think, given
Mhm.
our 30-year age gap, and me in the in the wanted direction, I guess. I, I've always had a bit of a chuckle, and other people have had a bit of a chuckle, but yeah, that it was actually me that had forgotten to do something. But
Mhm.
he was
Mhm. Yes.
a good sport about it all, and went ahead and recorded, notwithstanding my blunder. Yeah. And now I have you here. And now I have you here.
Mhm.
Another alumni, if you like, of the Cotswold community. And probably alongside the Mulberry Bush, one of the most recognised names in therapeutic communities, I guess, worldwide, and something about which there is some sadness that the Cotswold community is no longer.
Yes. Yes. Mm.
Yeah, but enough of me going on and on. I wonder whether we can start with perhaps you, because you had a certain role at the Cotswold as a therapeutic consultant. But I wonder if prior to us getting into that, if you might just give us a bit of a story or a tale about how you came to be a child psychotherapist in the first place.
Yes, thank you, Colby. Well, in 1971, I was 22 and I just finished university. And I suppose more than that, I just finished, completed, what is that, 16, 70 years of formal education. Um,
Mm,
and as I reflected on it, I, I realized that there was some kind of sadness as I looked back because school for me, the good parts of school, which I did enjoy very much, and also university, were really about friendships, the relationships I made. And I never felt especially excited or, or managed any passion for any of the subjects that I was being taught.
mm,
Um, and I I sort of worked out kind of how to play the system in a way, really. And there's some things that I felt I could do more easily than others, and those were the grounds on which I selected the specialties that I took up with. But I did have some sadness about it. In 1971, actually, this may be a refresher for hopefully for lots of people, but for those that don't, just an introduction to a name, was the time of Ivan Illich, who wrote a very important book called Deschooling Society, which was
mm,
a radical critique of compulsory education, um, and especially the way it was compartmentalized and institutionalized education, and was taken away almost from community life. Um, so, in fact, another contemporary at the time wrote a book called Contemporary Miseducation because he thought it served to alienate people from the learning experience.
mm,
I was very excited and inspired by this, and it got me interested in education. I was looking for something to do after university, and the education seemed to me to offer a career that intrigued me, especially when I was looking at it in the way that Ivan Illich was. Illich believed that the important focus for learning was what he called self-directed learning, that he thought the best way for children to learn was to begin with what really interested in them. And that way, they would engage more with the learning process and they'd be motivated to explore and to discover more and more about the particular areas and expand from that.
mm,
This model of learning had sort of consequences for the role of teachers. And Illich was highlighting always there was something very passive about the learning experience that followed from the hierarchy of teaching, in that what teachers were paid to do was to kind of deliver a curriculum to decide, not obviously individually, but the school system decided what the curriculum would be and how learning would take place in what sort of settings. So the model of teaching, and this is where I think I'm getting closer to my search for what I wanted to do, was more like that on Illich's model, more like teacher as facilitator, as guide, as mentor, alongside the learning experience of the child who was following his or her own interests and her own direction. So feeling like that, I was pleased to accept the offer of some part-time teaching in a college of further education, which was for young men. They're all men, actually, young men who were at college to study engineering. They were full-time engineers. And O-level English was a requirement for them to take to complete their qualification. So I thought this would be just what I was looking for, really, an opportunity. To me, English lessons sounded like an opportunity for open exploration and discussion and so on. So I went in that spirit of excitement on my first day to the college to begin this part-time work. I went in on my first morning to the staff room, where I was largely ignored by everybody, the teachers, but one teacher came over to speak to me and said how very, very pleased he was to see me there. So I felt grateful for that he'd come to say that to me. And he followed up by saying, yes, you see, the thing is, none of us here would ever take on this class. They're impossible. They don't want to do it. They resent being there, and they absolutely refuse to participate. So I had a rapid change of mood from excitement and the inspiration of the way I was thinking about how I was in touch with the work of Ivan Illich and the spirit of it. And my walk across to the classroom was a very different one from the walk that I had, if I'd been filmed, very different from the way I'd come into the building, an hour or so before. So standing in this classroom before the young people had arrived, I started to feel a real dread and panic. And they weren't there, and a part of me was thinking, I'm hoping this has been cancelled and there's something happened and I don't have to go through with this. But some minutes later, I heard a huge noise outside the classroom, and these young men, there must have been maybe 20 of them, but it seemed like 250 at the time, came in, paid absolutely no attention to me at all, and were sort of play fighting with each other, pulling at each other's clothing, mock punches and a whole hubbub of banter that was amongst themselves. Now, looking at them, I suddenly had this realization that I was only probably, a year or two older than something that never occurred to me before. But as a teacher, my superego was screaming at me. I needed to take charge of this situation to show my authority. And my first remark I made to them was, can we settle down, please? Because we've got a lot to get through in this year, as you know. This was the most unhelpful thing I could possibly do, because the impact was to raise noise levels in the room. After a few moments of this, I did have a stroke of luck because I realized there was no chair behind the desk where I was standing to give myself some kind of authoritative presence at the front of the class. So I had to walk down into where their chairs, which they'd all moved around all over the place in their play fighting and so on. And I sat on one that brought me much closer to them. And it was a stroke of luck because I had no intention, to gain anything from this. I just was doing my very best to get through this time. But what happened at that moment was that one of the young men, the one sitting nearest to me, turned to me, and they'd all been teasing each other about their clothes at this time, and one of them turned towards me and said to me, "Sir, you still got the receipt for that jacket you're wearing?" So I looked down and said, well, I think probably. And he said, "Well, you're going to need that when you take it back, aren't you?" Now, I couldn't help it. I mean, a voice inside me was saying, "Don't laugh. You need to, remain in authority here. They're trying to pull you down to their level." But I did laugh. I mean, it was very funny. I still chuckle about it now. And it really marked a turning point in the whole class joined in a very playful banter, of who does your hair, those kind of jokes. But it settled very quickly. Now, I do have to emphasize this was not a group of highly troubled young people who, as far as I knew, none of them had traumatic histories before. But it was something I did notice, in two important ways, which I drew on a lot when I did join the Cotswold community 20 years after that. Something about when I was in the grip of these very strong emotions, in my case, fear and anxiety and feeling out of control, how impossible it was for me to think of their situation at all. It was what we'd call nowadays, a failure to mentalize, really. I wasn't putting myself in their position. Later, of course, I began to be able to do that. But at that stage, I was so full of my own worries, I couldn't really see them at all. And I think what I did see from their side, though, was that they, far from feeling that they'd kind of seduced me into sort of joining their level, they actually felt that I had appreciated, the connection they were trying to make to me. And in a sense, I think later in Winnicottian language, I would think of this as a kind of appreciation that they realized they had contributed in some way, that I was enjoying something about them and they'd made a difference to me because of that. Certainly it settled them. Anyway, from that experience, and I reflected on this quite a lot at the time, but I did become more and more interested in the deschooling movement. And one book in particular really appealed to me, which was a book by George Denison, who was a great admirer of Illich, and of A.S. Neil in the UK. I don't know if you'd know that name, Colby, but he was the principal of a free school called Summerhill, and he was applying a lot of the psychoanalytic insights, not insults, insights.
That's a slip.
Yeah, not a real slip. In his work with the children. And I mean, one example of it was that there was one time a spate of stealing in the school community at Summerhill, and the children got together and decided that the best response to this was to give presents to the young person that was doing the stealing. And this, I think we're anticipating here Winnicott and the antisocial tendency. But what I liked about the book Lives of Children was the way that the person who wrote it um, saw behavior, not as the behavior of the children, not as something that needed to be managed or eliminated or controlled, but as a communication.
Mm.
And this was something new to me, and I think the way he put it was that the children's behavior was a way of asking for something that they really needed.
Mm.
Now, I'd never thought of that sort of thing before at all in that kind of a way, and it was very important kind of insight for me. I discovered as I looked at his own bio, or perhaps he said it during the book, but he was himself a therapist, and this got me interested in being in the kind of possibility of being able to see behind behavior, behind symptoms, to what was being expressed and what was driving these kind of things that were impacting on the adults in this case in the school. So from there, I decided that psychotherapy was the route I wanted to take. I wanted to be able to do this, and it seemed to me this would be something I'd like to try to apply outside of consulting rooms. I mean, I did appreciate the importance of the analytic model, and as part of my training, I had to be on a couch for 5 years myself, 3 times a week. That was part of how we were trained, and I got a huge amount from that. But the role of actually being an analyst in that way had no real appeal for me. I was very interested in the people like George Dennison who were applying these kind of ideas into other settings. And if I'd had the language at the time, I would have said something about the relational model as in a way that I could understand it was what was intriguing me. I didn't feel that, sitting behind someone who was on a couch was the kind of ordinary relationship that I would be looking to apply insights in. I thought, schools and foster care homes and so on, that would be the kind of place I'd be looking to apply these kind of insights. So I decided to do the psychotherapy, child psychotherapy training, and I found the ideas really exciting, really stimulating, and I still do enjoy the reading of Freud, but it was really Winnicott who, in terms of what the kind of psychotherapist I wanted to be, who I became really interested in. Now, I began the psychotherapy training, I think it was 1976 or 7, and in 1980, a group of us from the training went to the Cotswold Community on a day visit. And this was a really very important transformative experience for me. I had heard of the Cotswold Community, but I didn't really know very much about it. And when we went, we were introduced. Richard Balbirnie was there actually, and we met him. And then we were shown around the buildings by one of the adults who worked in one of the homes. And there was a very interesting thing happened. We happened to be standing near a window that had clearly been broken, and there were some adults were sweeping up the glass from the broken window. And one person in our group asked this man who was guiding us and showing us around the Cotswold Community, asked him, what do you do about these kind of situations when a child has broken a window? And I was really astounded by this young man's answer, because what he said, and remember the question was, what do you do about this? He said, well, one of the team is sitting with the young person now, and we are going to have a meeting all together as a team, because it's clear to us we've been missing something in his communication recently. Now, to me, at the level I've said I was intrigued by Winnicott, I really haven't connected everything up yet. And it was clear to me at that moment that I hadn't, because in my own mind, I was thinking, well, what's that going to do? Well, that's not doing anything. Surely there needs to be some restitution here. Perhaps the kind of things I was used to hearing about would be, a flow deduction from pocket money, or some sort of compromise restitution where the child would help help to sweep up the glass, that kind of thing. And he didn't go there at all, not at all. And it left me in some kind of turmoil. And I was thinking, but surely won't all the children start to, break windows as well in that case, when nothing happens? Fortunately, I asked one of my colleagues who really picked this up much more quickly than me, why they weren't, instituting some sort of restitution. And he said to me, perhaps because they don't want to reinforce breaking windows. Now, I thought to myself, that sounds very good. I don't know what it means quite, but I think you're onto something there. And so I went home that day and I found that I had bought the collected works of Dockar-Drysdale, and I read her first paper called, well, the short title is Damage and Restitution. And I found it absolutely amazing. I was very pleased to be at the conference a few weeks ago now on Dockar-Drysdale's work, and I was recommending this paper to the people there, because it really is excellent. And I think it was that experience I had was an introduction to the way the theory was embodied in the practice. So if I'd been a keen sort of follower of Winnicott's work before that, I was kind of doubly convinced when I heard about what Mrs. Drysdale was doing. I had sometimes thought myself, be interesting if somebody could find a way to apply Winnicott's work to a kind of childcare setting, and then I found out somebody had been doing this for quite a long time, and that was Mrs. Drysdale. So that was what drew me, and from then onwards, I had a very strong interest in the Cotswold community, and that's why 10 years later or so, I applied to join as the consultant psychotherapist, and I was actually, Mrs. Drysdale had retired at that time, and I was interviewed by her, and I was very, very impressed with her. I mean, I thought she was inspirational at that time, and combined that, I think, with a very genuine interest in me, the person that she was sitting with at the time. So it was a powerful experience, and I was lucky enough to have a formal interview with her, and also to get to know her socially over the weeks after I started. She invited her husband, and she invited me to their home for supper several times, and so I saw another side of her, which I could talk about as well. But so that was really how I got to the community. Which must be 30 years ago now, and a bit more than that, perhaps. So
yeah. So you so if my maths are right, you got there, I think, in the late 80s or early 90s.
1991 until 2000. I was there for 9 years.
Yeah. And I guess you were stepping into big shoes going
Yes.
there, like very big shoes. I mean, I wonder how that felt, and what you saw, what you understood to be the role that you were taking on at that time.
Well, those are really important questions. One the beginning of my answer is that Mrs. Drysdale herself really facilitated this for me, actually, because I had questions myself about whether it was wise for me in taking up this role to keep in the kind of social contact with her afterwards. Um, but I decided to do it, and I was very struck by how she continued to be very, very interested in me as a person and in my own experience, as a father and as a practitioner in child and adolescent mental health services and child psychiatry in London. And she never once asked me anything about, what I was doing at the community. I mean, she must have had questions in her own mind about, what I was up to and what I might be doing with some of the things that she built up so carefully. But she never conveyed that to me at all. It was very facilitating and very permissive, and sort of really on my side, I think, and being very pleased that I was there and that I was, bringing all my experience and my experience as an independent practitioner to the work. So that helped me a great deal. The other thing, which I think is something that John Whitwell talks about rightly all the time, was that this role, my specific role, was really as consultant to the therapeutic care and therapeutic education teams. But we had people like Eric Miller, Isabel Menges Live, Dr. Colin Morrison, Dr. Faith Spicer, Nick Oak, the educational psychologist, and so on. We had a lot of consultants to the organization who were really keeping their eye on the primary task from a kind of systemic overview and looking at practices within the community and how much they may improve or facilitate the delivery of the primary task, and where they might be getting it, in the way of that. I mean, the famous example, I think, perhaps from Isabel Menges Live's time, was when she heard that in those early days at the community there was a central kitchen. I think you may have heard of the story from other people, and I think she never explained this to me, but I think there was a sense in which if the primary task was about primary provision for young children, analogous to young children in families, then the idea of a central kitchen which took no account of individual relationships to carers and individual relationships to what the child were eating and how and where they were eating and what they were eating and so on, didn't really seem to fit with the primary task. And so she advised that the community would be better for all the food to be prepared by the adults who cared for the children within the homes. So Eric Miller and other consultants were always looking at the place of everything that happened within the community from that perspective, and that included the work that I was doing. In a sense, that was quite protected, and my role was to work with the teams of people, the social care workers, that we didn't call them that, and the education, the teachers, to work with them on their work with the children in the homes and the community polys, we call them, schools. So was there anything more to the question?
No, I think that's a lovely answer, and I think as you mentioned John Whitwell and you've mentioned Barbara Dockar-Drysdale, and I recently had John Whitwell back on the podcast subsequent to the conference that you were talking about, where he spoke about Barbara Dockar-Drysdale, and he talked, yeah, very clearly about the consultant role as being one to, Mrs. D. She goes by various names
Yeah,
in
she
various
does. Mm.
contexts. Um, that she really saw herself as a consultant to the teams, to the
Mhm.
adults, and as a facilitator of them being able to do the direct therapeutic work with the
Yes.
children.
Mm.
And I wonder if you saw your role or followed that kind of that same path when you were there, subsequent to her.
Yes, definitely. Yes. I mean, I was very fortunate in that respect, and that I think, I was already convinced by the model, and I'd read all of her writings, and I felt very, very comfortable about working in that way. Um,
Mm,
and but the where my role was made much easier was because of the kind of level of external support to the whole community from the consultants that I mentioned, because I think what was valued, I think, was that I was an independent practitioner working in other settings, and so I could, whilst being extremely sympathetic to, more than sympathetic, but convinced by by the model, I could also bring in other kind of ideas or reflections from my work outside. There was one very simple way in which that was immediately clear to me, that in my child and adolescent mental health services work, I was speaking the language of attachment, and in the community, we were speaking about unintegration and
mm,
integration. And I found it very interesting to transition between these two languages. I had no difficulty whatsoever myself. And, and I did, I think, sometimes use that kind of language in the community,
mm,
in order I suppose, widen the vocabulary a little bit, and in order that because the carers and the teachers would be liaising with social workers who are, and others from outside who would very likely be talking in the language of attachment and so on. Um, but it was an important principle of consultancy, and it was one I was trained in. I was very committed to that. The consultant is not a supervisor, not a manager, not on the payroll, not a paid employee in the way that
mm,
the other members of the Cotswold community were. All the consultants were independent practitioners who would come for a specific period of time and leave at the end of the day, or in my case, 2 days.
mm,
And what I brought was an experience as an outsider. So I wasn't. The model would say this made it a little easier, perhaps, to see where institutions were getting a little bit sort of inward looking.
mm,
We always brought the outsider's perspective, and I brought a professional opinion, which of course I expected this to be taken seriously, but I wasn't there to direct the treatment
mm,
in any kind of a way, or to advise or tell them what to do. Um, and I think it's to the credit of the Cotswold community. I don't think that ever was a problem. I don't think I ever heard a practice that it was so sort of serious that I had to say something like, "Look, I think I need to talk to some of the
mm,
senior managers about that." But I was there to be consulted about the issues that arose in the work, and I suppose that my particular application of Mrs. Drysdale and Winnicott's ideas was that I thought of this in two ways, really. A central idea, central distinction in Winnicott's theory was that between the mother as environment mother and the mother as object. Now, these were clumsy terms, and I obviously wasn't comfortable about using them, and I tried not to. But thinking really about the importance of carers and what their function was in providing the primary care that these young people needed. So when we came together, well, let me start a bit further down the line. One of the special sort of challenges I felt for me was my realization early on that a lot of the people that were coming to work with us had very little, I think John spoke about this actually, John Whitwell, very little direct experience of working with children, with young children, and certainly not with children who had experiences of trauma. And it was a very interesting situation because we weren't doing a kind of formal interview along the lines that human resources would very much be in charge of. We were meeting these young adults who were clearly always very motivated, I think, to do this work. But it was, as much as anything, really an opportunity for them to see whether what was involved in the work was something they were prepared to commit to, really. So we had to, in a sense, be pleased with their enthusiasm and motivation and determination to join us, and also prepare them for the fact that the work actually was going to be difficult. And of course, one of the ways in which it's difficult is the impact on the carers themselves of the way that the children express their distress. I often remind people of this story of Mary Main, the great attachment researcher, and one of the original contributors to the adult attachment interview, because Mary Main used to say that the adult attachment interview surprised the unconscious. Now, the adult attachment interview is a structured interview in a clearly safe situation, but people participating in it are asked to remember their childhood and remember aspects of their relationship with their mother and father, and this kind of conversation put them in touch with their own attachment wounds, but obviously in a safe and a contained environment. What was different, of course, about working directly with young people who have had a trauma history is that it doesn't come to you like that. And going back to this idea about behavior and extending that to symptoms into a Winnicottian kind of framework, the whole idea of this behavior, in a way, was to impact on the carers. I think Richard Rawlinson on a previous podcast of yours spoke about how when a child fears that they're not in your mind, there's something they will do to make sure they are on your mind.
On your mind.
Yeah, and I think this is a very helpful way of putting it. I mean, in ordinary experience, if I'm sitting with somebody who is a little hard of hearing, I will raise my voice. And if somebody's, very hard of hearing, I'll talk even louder. And what these young people were communicating, I think, in their very strong ways to connect with the adults who cared for them, was that they were in search of something, and they needed the adults' full attention on this, to be sure that they had that there was a chance that they were being heard. What they were looking for, of course, was a missing relational experience, basically, and they were looking for something that they felt they hadn't had enough of, or perhaps felt they hadn't had at all, or something that was taken from them prematurely. and they were looking to rediscover this, and this was done through this almost desperate way in which they would communicate their distress to the carers. The consequence for the carers, of course, is that they're subject to very strong feelings themselves, and kind of rather, I would go beyond saying surprised. They're startled to have experiences of their own attachment wounds stimulated in this kind of a way. So, what I felt we were doing in the team meetings and the individual meetings was really two things. One is that we spoke about unintegration and the role of the carer in regard to this. That initially the parents gather together the initially unconnected aspects of a baby's experience, and and somehow gather this together, and to facilitate the self-integrating task, really, of the child. So the child's organization of his own experience depends on, and takes on many of the qualities of the mother's previous, or the father's and the father's organization of their perceptions of him. I'm not sure if I put that very well, but that we don't. There's a sense in which the child doesn't feel himself or herself to be any unified, stable personality originally, but the parents, by gathering together these disconnected bits of experience, will help the child to feel, have access to the full range of his experiences, if I can put it that way. So, in one sense, and Winnicott uses a very important phrase there when he talks about the child who has no, now he says one other to help him gather his parts together, starts with a handicap in his own self-integrating task. And I think this is a really interesting phrase, because I think it captures the sort of the kind of co-regulation aspect of this. This isn't something only done by the parent, but by the parent, in doing this, facilitates something within the child that enables him to have full range to all of his experience, many of which have been forced into disconnection from each other because of difficulty in their previous relationships to their carers. A very important Winnicottian and Drysdale idea was how the parents, function as mirrors to the child's experience. Winnicott's beautiful phrase, when I look, I'm seen, and so I exist. And this is something about in empathic entunement. The mother reflects the child's own experience back to him, and the child gets to know himself through his mother's and his father's eyes, and through their care. So we didn't have one person doing this with our children there. We had a team of people, and in many ways there was an advantage to this, really, because it was clear in team meetings how the child, the way it was put was the child would show different parts of himself. Remember, we were only talking about boys at the community, to different members of the team. So occasionally it would happen that team members would say, "Your child, he does that with you. I've never seen that at all." And so one likely explanation of that was that certain adults might have particular blind spots or difficulties in being open to certain kind of communications from the children. because of their own attachment wounds and so on. So that
Mm.
as a team, we could kind of assemble together a picture that was kind of getting to know the whole child by all of the different interactions. We'd go around the room talking about how each child felt alongside this the child that they were working with. So that was, in a sense, a kind of, one kind of advantage, really, that, it's a truism, isn't it, that we can't look at someone else's pain if we can't look at that area in ourselves. And there might be certain communications that children wanted their carers to know about that some adults really weren't quite ready to go there themselves and didn't want that opened up. I mean, that's a very human thing. And I think the team approach, I think we could, in a sense, bring that to light, but in an indirect way, and get to know the whole child better by assembling the view that the individual team members were bringing.
And bring integration.
And bringing, yes, and facilitating integration. So that was, so one of the things we would do would be to meet as teams, and one of the things we would do there was to, try to bring all the aspects, everything we knew about the child together to assemble our organized perception of him, in order that could then be, in a sense, given back to the child, who gets to know himself, through that process. The other thing that is very important to mention here, this came up in particular, I think, in the one-to-one sessions I had with the people that worked there. The model was that I came 2 days a week, and I met with all of the teams together on one of the days, and also individuals from teams as well. And working with the individuals, and also to an extent with the teams, too, along the lines I've said, but working with individuals, there was one very specific kind of analogy or metaphor that I was often very aware of, that a lot of what we were doing was a kind of, when the adult came over to see me, a kind of de-rolling. When you do role play in family therapy or in teaching or something, and you take on roles consensually, obviously, you agree to do it for the purpose of the role play. At the end of the role play, there's a very important moment which you shouldn't rush through, when you de-roll. When your attention comes back and you go back into yourself, I suppose, in a way. Being one of the features, I think, in working with children who have a trauma history, is how you can get pulled. It can feel like you get pulled into playing certain sorts of parts, which you haven't kind of consciously agreed to, of course, in a way. This is something that children need to do. We say that the children bring their environment that lives within them wherever they go, and this is their internal environment, their internal world, and the relationships in it are peopled with unpredictable, unreliable, and ambivalent, all sorts of different attachment figures, and they in their movement towards cure and towards integration, they will obviously see those looking after them in a variety of ways, sometimes with very rapid transition from one moment to the next. So you could, begin an afternoon with a child who's treating you almost as if you are their rescuer, and that can very quickly turn into you being seen as their persecutor, and then all sorts of projections of that order can happen, and very, very fast and very powerfully, for reasons we've said before. These are urgent needs being expressed, and they are being expressed in the child's journey towards trying to in a sense, test out an environment to see whether it's strong enough to withstand, their worst feelings about themselves, in a way, So from the worker's point of view, this is very, very difficult. And this is happening kind of all day long, rapid change of roles that you feel you're being pulled into, into playing, with all the attendant feelings that come with that. And so at some point in that day, they may have a scheduled meeting with me, and they're in walking from the house to my room. I imagined that they were thinking that they were going into another role situation of meeting with the psych man, which was going to bring up all sorts of other feelings for them. So I felt a very important part of my work there was really to help them de-role, in a sense. And I did that in a kind, not by talking about that, but by connecting with them in the way that I would when we de-role after a role play exercise, in a demonstration or in a therapy moment. In a sense, I was genuine. This wasn't a technique. I mean, I was genuinely interested in them as people, and and really, in a sense, I was very interested in how they were managing their days, how they grounded themselves, how they coped with the kind of pressures that were on them, and so on. So I would try to, I remember things about them, ask questions about what I knew them to be interested in, and remember them from previous conversations and so on. And in my mind, this was part of this process, really, of getting back into themselves in order to do what I think is the essence of this work. And I think this is, I'm talking here the contemplative traditions going back thousands of years, and Winnicott right up to polyvagal theory now, that the essential task, really, when it comes down to it, is presence and being there for the children, because what they are doing is searching for missing relational experiences of being seen, listened to, of being felt. Dan Siegel has a good phrase that they're looking to feel felt. So what they're after is a certain kind of compassionate witnessing that is the essence, I think, of working with traumatized people. And how do we do that at our best when we are grounded and centered and that kind of language? I mentioned the contemplative traditions. I had in my office, in one of my offices, a translation from the great Tao, which I found to be absolutely beautiful. And in one particular translation, there's a moment when the pupil says, "Master, what do I do in the face of the suffering of another? What do I do in the face of suffering of another?" And the master says, "Stand out of the way." And I think this is really important. I stopped having it in my office because a colleague saw it one time and said, "It's a very neglectful kind of attitude, isn't it? Sort of like, what is, and heard it in completely, I think, an unintended way, definitely, but a way I'd never even thought of that possibility, because I thought of it much more that it's really about this relational experience is about really feeling felt, and that some communication, that this experience that's being conveyed is very, very important, and not something for you to rush into fixing or into expert mode or any kind of behavior that takes you away from just listening really listening to what somebody is trying to tell you about what their experience was. Now, if you listen to Stephen Porges, the founder of polyvagal theory, this is something he talks about, I think, beautifully when he steps back from that theory and talks generally about, well, it's not stepping back from it really, but the specifics of it, when he talks about what trauma, what is really important when being with people who have had traumatic experiences. And it's very much that. And I felt that really in one-to-one situations, that's what we were trying to do in order that they could go back to the situation, having de-rolled, gone back to being present themselves and in themselves, and be alongside the children, and able to be there for them. So that's what I thought we were doing, and I think that was also part of the team meeting experience as well. I think that's what we were all doing there as well. In fact, I mentioned this as well at the Dockar-Drysdale conference. I heard Stephen Porges talking about some work that he had done with some Ukrainian therapists, and he the moment came for him to go online, and when they came online, they said to him they'd just come out of a bomb shelter. So they were standing outside this bomb shelter, and they said that they'd come out because they couldn't get the signal inside the shelter, and in order to communicate with him, they had to be outside. And he spoke a little bit about how responsible he felt because they put themselves in very dangerous situation. But one question he asked them was that he said, "What do you actually do? What were you doing in this bomb shelter when you were all together?" And they told him that they were singing Ukrainian national songs. And he said, I think what they were doing was co-regulating. And they were therapists, and in order for them to go out and help with the self-regulation of their clients, self-regulation is preceded by, depends on co-regulation. First of all, this is the essence of the Winnicott-Drysdale kind of approach, and that, I think that example, and of course it's rich with possible other symbols and metaphors to explain, war zones and bomb shelters and so on. But that part about the co-regulation, I think, is important, because I think that's what we were doing in the team meetings too, together. I mean, I certainly was, I'm the first to admit this. My work consisted of the meeting with the teams who work with the children, but I also had direct connection with the children that came to the community, because I would, and it wasn't only me who did this, but I would meet them at their earliest arrival time at the community on their own. I'd read their papers, and I knew a lot about them from their recorded histories, and they had a time with me and with other people from the management, on the management side, and other consultants too, I think. And this was a moment when I really kind of powerfully connected up the histories as written about them and the child in front of me, and I really was tracking my own kind of countertransference at these times. And, my first thought was, and I was very worried about the first time I did this, because I had a kind of ethical objection to, Ainsworth's strange situation experiment, which I could see what the research benefits were, but it seemed to me very cruel to set this up with, a mother being, instructed to leave a child, in the presence of people he didn't know, or she didn't know.
Not dissimilar to
Sorry?
the still face experiments, I
Yes,
think.
exactly. Very,
Mm,
very similar to that. And I had great ethical
mm,
difficulty with this. And my first worry in agreeing to do this was that I was, in a sense, doing something very similar. That children were arriving with all sorts of relationship difficulty, and they were being put in a situation with somebody that they didn't know at all. Um, and I felt this was, not fair. But actually, my first experience of it did make me feel better, because although the children, almost all of them, did arrive like this, I think something, about the way I was not trying to make it too easy, but I was ensuring that my communications of safety were something I was really keeping my eye on. I could talk more about that another time, but that, and my tone was good. And so, and I felt I was alongside them, imaginatively and in my heart, about this experience they were having in sitting there with me. And they were having, obviously, they just arrived all around the whole community with lots of people. And I did see them, actually, almost all of them changed from this state, which would, if you'd read their histories, you'd never think this child was capable of sitting still like this, for 1 second, let alone 10 minutes.
mm.
But, I think once they had this experience of kind of feeling a little safer, or feeling the connection a little more. That's what I hoped was happening. They would, in a sense, go up the kind of the ladder in terms of autonomic nervous system and move into fight and flight. They became very interested in outside noises, wandering around, picking things up in the room, and really, they really changed. In a way, that was quite striking to see. You know, because I think before the amount of anxiety was so great that they even dropped down from fight and flight. They went below that. And again, coming in with how the community worked, we did try really hard to make this the best experience we could for them, recognizing how difficult it was. So I would always try to ensure it was the same carer that they'd all begun to form a relationship with, who would bring them over, and we would spend that moment together before the child sat with me on their own. And then the carer would say, I'll come back and, come and collect you, in so many minutes. And so that was an important part of the process. And obviously, I took steps, inside the room to make sure that they realised that they could go at any point, and what would happen if it was becoming too much, and so on and so on. They never ever did that. So I think we were ourselves co-regulating in team meetings, which I think was really, really important. As I said, it certainly was to me, because I did say to the children in this first meeting, you will see me around the building. You should know that when the adults are coming for meetings, it's me they're coming to talk with. And, I'd like you to feel that you could come whenever you wanted to, for any kind of reason. But the other thing too was, I was always very worried for them, because I had met them and seen how fearful they could be and how they could freeze, and also, I knew their histories and had that kind of felt that connection and responsibility towards them too. And similarly for the adults, who came in not really knowing what to expect, I prepared them, as John and others did as well, as best we could, to what they might. And I used to say to them, look, it's not if your histories of your own are being stimulated. It's when, really, we have to. It's going to happen, and I think we all tried to give them, obviously, a way to think about this as very important to the child, that they do have this impact on us, and it's not personal. We obviously explained it in that kind of way, but I was careful at the same time not to try to soft soap this and to make this sound as though this is actually quite an easy thing to do, because it's, as we all know, it isn't. It's very, very difficult work. And it was obviously what we wanted was people who were prepared to stick with the work, and see have the longer view and see the benign intention of everything there. But it was, it's a lot to ask of people to do, of course. Somebody, that meeting I had in 1980, where Richard Balbirnie was there, one of my colleagues on the day said, how do you get people Richard had said that adults work 80 to 90 hours a week. And somebody said to Richard Balbirnie, how do you get adults to do that? And he said, well, I say to them when they come, you get into this work or you get out of it. When he said it very nicely, but I mean, it's so true, really. And getting into it was, in a sense, exposing yourself to these kind of situations, which were all, in a sense, opportunities for the child to test, the strength of the environment and to test out how good the parenting that we were promising them really was, because that was the sense in which they needed the adults to survive their aggression, of course, and their destructive behaviors, and so on, and to carry on being good parents, being resilient. This enabled the children to start to believe that the unit was strong enough, to withstand whatever the child threw at them, because their own experience was, they had these early experiences were of a very difficult kind, and subsequent placements all broke down. And of course, their conclusion was that this was to do with them and to do with what they did and their beliefs about themselves. And it takes a lot of challenging. For us to and wake up, and it's they're not going to believe in what we say we're going to do. They're going to put it to the test, of course. So
Paul, I think that was just a wonderful insight of some depth into the work that was done by you, and I guess with you in that time that you're at the Cotswold Community. It is, of course, no longer around. How do you think that the Cotswold Community should be remembered? How do you think it should be remembered?
I think really in the way, I think Mrs. Drysdale's work should be remembered, in a very systematic and serious way to apply some of these terms and ideas that could sound idealistic or woo-woo even, I think, sometimes. But I thought I think that paper on damage and restitution is a masterpiece, I think. And I used to say to people, read that, then read everything else she wrote, and then come back to that one again, because I think it's all really implicit in there. And what the community did well, which I think should be done, is they took, we took seriously the needs of the adults as best we could, the ones doing the work. They had access to the range of consultants. They did have, they were encouraged to read, and they on training days were organized. This kind of, putting it crudely, but this feeding of the adults, and this respect for the work that they were doing, I think, and valuation of it is really, really important, I think, and of course, ideally, this is reflected in better pay for this very important work, but and also I think moves towards a more kind of professional trainings and so on, which I think there are organisations who are doing that. But the legacy, I think, really, is about how do we support the adults best to do this really, really important work.
I'd say so.
I mean, and I think that does need a lot of. I think people who commission services ought to go speak to people who are at the community and hear directly from them. I think because it certainly was an inspiration to me, and I think I became a better person for my own time I spent there. I think a lot of people that work there would say the same.
Yeah,
and of course, lots of children and young people benefited hugely from it. So I think in keeping the literature alive, I think and the importance of training and support and regular reflection spaces for the adults, meeting all the needs of the children that I said, but then meeting the adult needs as well. For co-regulation and so on.
And also, I mean, what's coming through really strongly for me is that it is the creation of a growing environment. That's John Whitwell talked about the creation of a growing environment, and I think, and in other ways, things that he has said about the Cotswold community across 2 podcast interviews with me, as well as other conversations I've had, reflects that it was a growing environment, not just for the boys, but also for the staff.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think, and I think adults did begin to say things like they felt this had impacted on themselves as partners, and as friends and as parents and family members. They felt that this being put in these difficult situations and coming through them was a very important experience for lots of people there, I think. And you certainly, we tend to pick our friends, don't we, by the people who will support our own kind of versions of ourselves. And the children, of course, are not interested in that. Doesn't do anything for them. They will give you impact on you and give you, exposure to parts of yourself that you may not be very comfortable with, but it'll really be very important to you to own those and recognize them in yourself if you want to be a better partner and so on.
And I think that part of the legacy of the Cotswold community is there's no shortage of people for me to have on the podcast who have gone on to have quite remarkable careers, and that's amongst staff and young people that were residing in the Cotswold community in the day. But Paul, it's been. I wonder if you feel like the time has gone quickly, because it does very much feel to me like the time of our conversation has gone very quickly. We're about an hour and a half into it. I feel like I could talk to you for a lot longer.
I did anticipate this different. I mean, I just had 9 years of this incredibly rich experience. I know I could feel I was in such a hurry, really, why I tripped up over myself and so on. I just felt there were so many things I wanted to say, and I apologize at the speed at which I was delivering it. But it reflects really, how important it was to me and how alive, I felt, and including the ups and downs of it all, and the roller coasters, rides, and so on. But there's so much I want to say and to express about it.
Mm.
Um,
And
so
well, maybe we can have
I
another
apologize if it came out very
conversation.
fast.
Yeah. Sorry, maybe
Yeah, yeah.
maybe we can have another conversation soon.
Oh, yes, thank you.
There's lots of what you've said that really resonates with me, and I've learnt some things as well. Obviously, as you do, I love. I actually really. It's not been put in this way, and I think you said it was in part either a Winnicottian or Dockar-Drysdale or both, but um, the idea of the children revealing different parts of themselves to different people. And I think John said something like that. But the idea of the team meeting being an integration,
Yes.
creating a whole child in the eyes of the adults. And I think that's certainly something that I'll take away from this conversation and apply in my own work, I think, because I mean my work is primarily as a psychotherapist. Um, with the children and young people, and I see a certain side of them, I guess, and
Mm,
uh, it is helpful to, I think, I don't always get to see what other people get to see. Sometimes I hear about it, but not in a deliberate way, and that's, I think, something that I really want to turn my mind to going
mm,
forwards. Yeah.
mm,
But
mm.
thank you, Paul.
Well,
That was
enjoy.
great.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Colby. Good to speak with you. Mm.